the tricky thing about alcohol use disorder too is then it creates symptoms of its own over time. So some of these symptoms really overlap and it's hard to tell. We really have to go back to the origins of when people started problematically drinking to really be able to kind of closely connect the two. And again, that's why I do so many assessments and proper diagnosis, because that's what we're really trying to determine what's alcohol use disorder and what's trauma for each person individually.
Welcome, everybody. Today I'm here with Gabrielle and Net. Gabrielle is an alcohol and drug counselor as well as a trauma specialist. And I've gotten to know you probably this last year or so, and I've just
Hmm.
learned so much from you about, your work and really your specialty in trauma and particularly how it links with substance use or alcohol use disorder. So I wondered if you wanted to just start by telling us a little bit about your background and the work that you do with people who have both substance use or alcohol use disorder and then, a history of trauma as well.
Yeah, great. And well, thanks so much for having me on, Katie. I have enjoyed getting to know you over the last year, and I appreciate all the efforts and work you're doing to, um, really kind of help spread the word about the Sinclair Method and that there's other options and other ways to treat alcohol use disorder. So I appreciate that. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting story because there aren't a lot of us that really specialize in both. And I actually am duly licensed in both mental health and substance use. So again, that's a little bit more on the rare side. And kind of how that came to be is it started first with my own experience with trauma therapy. So I found myself dealing with a lot of depression in my early 20s, and really nothing seemed to be helping, kind of traditional therapy and treatment. And fortunately, was fortunate enough to have actually an integrative physician say to me, I think you have PTSD. And nobody had told me that up until that point. And she connected me with a trauma therapist. And it was such a profound, life-changing experience. And so that led me to change careers and say that, this was so impactful and so profound for me that I want to be part of helping others get this help sooner. And, for me, it was about 10 years or so of before I was really properly diagnosed. So that started me on the journey of my second career and, going to graduate school and becoming a licensed counselor. And I actually moved to a different state because they had a school that would allow me to concentrate in trauma at the master's level. So I started really as a trauma therapist. That was the original kind of intention. And so then I went through school and I, learned all about what I learned about. And then I graduated and sort of got my business card and hung my shingle and said, everybody who has trauma, come see me. And nobody was knocking at the door. And I was a little bit perplexed by that, but, kind of quickly realized that there are so many people suffering with trauma that don't realize that they are. And so outside of veterans, there are many people, who people only associate PTSD with veterans. And veterans, can identify and recognize and get help, but there's a lot of people that have trauma and don't realize it. And so I asked myself, okay, where do I find these people? And so I started doing some research and, found some statistics on trauma and alcohol use disorder. And, the statistics were pretty high. Like there's a pretty high correlation between the two. So almost 50% of people with chronic PTSD, meaning they have it, sort of chronically, also meet the criteria for substance use disorder. 52% of men with PTSD will also get diagnosed with alcohol use disorder, substance use disorder. And for women, it's like 30%, but I think that's changing. Like these numbers are over 10 years ago. And they haven't done some, I mean, there are some updated studies, but so I think those numbers are a lot higher. Like for instance, women with PTSD are, 3 times as likely to develop substance use disorder. And 4 times as likely to develop a drug addiction. So not just alcohol, but have drug addiction. So the numbers are really high. And so then I said, that's where I want to start to really help and serve people is obviously folks with, PTSD are reaching for substances as a way to cope. And so I entered kind of the field of, substance use treatment. And as I mentioned, of course, this this actually happened while I was getting my internship. So I decided to do an internship in substance use. So let me kind of backtrack for a second. So I decided to do an internship in at a substance use treatment. And that's really where I saw like this is the place to help people. So then when I graduated and nobody was coming, I said, "Oh, okay, I know where to reach people." So I did get have the schooling both for trauma and substance use, and I started working with people in substance use, and really found that most of the treatment wasn't addressing trauma, and that these were somehow in the treatment space 2 separate things, right? Like you deal with your alcohol use, and then at some point you deal with trauma later down the road. And I really felt like that was not a good treatment model. And so I've really kind of spent, the last dozen years in inpatient and outpatient in my own practice, and also consulting and working, with and for other treatment centers to change that. It's like, no, we need to address both of them from day one.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that because it's interesting. I was recently talking with a client who was in a drug and alcohol treatment program, and they were not aware that they were doing the Sinclair method, and they would not treat their trauma until they were absolutely substance and alcohol free.
Yeah.
And this person was having like a breakdown because they're like, like the therapy was helping me, but now they want me to like quit cold turkey. What am I supposed to do? And so I think what's so
Yeah.
unique about you is that you support the Sinclair method and you work with people while they're using this harm reduction approach, which is incredible. So I'm curious, like, do you think people need to be absolutely alcohol free before they can make progress with, doing this trauma work or trauma healing?
I don't. However, I do think there's a lot of nuance to that and to the treatment approach. And I think one of the biggest challenges with the traditional treatment model, which I'm a very outspoken, critic of, is that it's a one size fits all, that there's these very black and white, kind of decisions that are made. Now, if their alcohol use disorder is such that they are drinking, very heavily, very severely, they are intoxicated most of the day, no, I don't think you can start to treat their trauma effectively at that point. However, if somebody is, in a moderate stage or is in a stage of alcohol use that allows for some intervention to start to treat their trauma, I think by all means that's essential, because that was my experience in working at abstinence-based treatment centers for a good 5-6 years. When I first started, is people went from using substances to abstinent, within a 24-hour period. And then for some people within days, for some people within weeks of being abstinent, their PTSD was so unmanaged, so out of control that something had to be done. And these facilities weren't addressing that. And so people then set up the relapse cycle. And it's not that they didn't want to be abstinent, they did. It's not that they were unwilling or incompliant or any of the things that I think sometimes people can be told. It's that they could not function with the PTSD symptoms when they were not using alcohol. And so, I think everybody is unique and individual. And I think some people, their alcohol is so severe, they may need to, it could be life threatening and they may need to stop drinking in order to begin treatment. But I think for a lot of people, those can happen simultaneously.
Well, that's really reassuring to hear because I do feel like it has been, just being in the Sinclair Method world the past 5 years. Like, I think you're the first counselor, and granted, I don't know everyone, but that works with people who you don't require the abstinence right out the gate. I know several people who are going to therapists and getting, additional support, but their therapist really isn't on board with TSM. So I just think you have
Yeah.
such a unique niche and practice that you offer for people.
Yeah, and let me just kind of clarify that a little bit further too, which I think this is the misconception that a lot of people make around treating trauma is that they think only about kind of what we call exposure therapy or like phase two of trauma therapy, which is like where you're actually dealing with memories, you're processing. Um, there are depending on what kind of model you're following, there's multiple stages of trauma treatment. And so, what I find works really well, and this is what I do in my private practice, is the first stage of trauma treatment works really well with the extinction, the first really 3 to 6 months of extinction with Sinclair. So, what that looks like is, we're working on all of the, kind of habits and principles around Sinclair and making sure that, the person is 100% compliant, they're at the right dosage, they're following kind of all the, the protocol around the Sinclair method. And at the same time, we're doing proper diagnoses and assessment of trauma. So many people never get that. So we're doing assessments, we're diagnosing, we're identifying what the symptoms are. I'm providing a lot of education to help them understand what's happening in their brain and body, why they're having some of the experiences they're having. We're figuring out, is there trauma related to relationships? Is there trauma related to something else? We're finding out their patterns, their triggers, and we're developing healthy coping skills for those triggers and those symptoms. So that is the first sort of phase of treating trauma. And I do that with everybody, whether they have alcohol use disorder or not. But how I partner that with somebody with alcohol use disorder is that really goes nicely with, again, that first 3 to 6 months of the Sinclair method, where people are, following the protocol, they're getting in good habits, and they're getting to that place where now they have more control over their drinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, that's really clear. And I was curious
And
because,
then,
oh, go ahead.
oh,
Sorry.
yeah, no, well, then I was going to say, and then once they're at a point where their drinking is managed and they've reached extinction, then we begin to go into phase two of doing that deeper trauma work. And that's where we're reprocessing. We're using, mostly, I use EMDR. I use other things too, but we're using those modalities to begin to process on that deeper level. So I just wanted to provide that clarification. I think that's where some of the confusion comes in. And I think that's where treatment, other traditional treatment is like, well, no, we can't process if somebody is using alcohol. Well, yes, there's some truth to that, but there's a lot that needs to happen before you even process. And so, once somebody's at extinction and they're at a managed point, then we begin that work.
So how long is like if someone comes to you with alcohol use disorder with a history of trauma, like how long are you working with them for generally?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And it's really hard to answer because everybody's trauma is different and their symptoms are different. And so, you know, somebody that's had maybe one traumatic event in the last year is very different than who has had trauma from childhood. And so I can't really speak to how long that is because it all depends on, how severe their trauma is, what the symptoms they're experiencing, and, really the number of traumas that they have.
And you mentioned earlier, too, that sometimes people just don't know that they have trauma. So there very could well be people who are drinking excessively due to trauma and they may not even know. So what are the signs, if
Exactly.
someone's watching, what's the signs that they can look out for to know like that my drinking is a result of trauma?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and we can kind of go over the sort of general criteria around trauma. Um, and what I'll say to that is the tricky thing about alcohol use disorder too is then it creates symptoms of its own over time. So some of these symptoms really overlap and it's hard to tell. We really have to go back to the origins of when people started problematically drinking to really be able to kind of closely connect the two. And again, that's why I do so many assessments and proper diagnosis, because that's what we're really trying to determine: what's alcohol use disorder and what's trauma for each person individually. But in general, so, trauma can um, look like a number of different things. Typically, people have high anxiety with trauma. And so I've had many people say that they don't realize that they've just always had a level of anxiety. It's just their norm. They don't see it as sort of a higher level of anxiety than most people have. So again, that's why in doing some of the assessments in our conversation, we can really help determine if some people may have had trauma from childhood and have just always felt like they were tightly wound or high strung or always kind of worrisome or always anxious. But that's a kind of a classic symptom. Sleep disturbances are another classic symptom of trauma. So, whether that's difficulty falling asleep, whether that's an inability to stay asleep, whether that's nightmares that they remember, or not remembering your dreams whatsoever. There's a lot of different kind of symptoms that can go along with sleep. And that's one of the first things, it's the first symptoms that people see with trauma. Another thing is avoidance of stressful situations or things that remind them of trauma. So it's not uncommon if somebody's come from, let's say, a family that there was a lot of dysfunction. Maybe there was, alcohol use disorder. Maybe there was abuse, that people are estranged or avoid family interactions and avoid seeing their family because it just triggers all of that trauma. So that's another one, is avoidance. Seeking out things to calm down, with your anxiety. That could be alcohol, that could be cannabis, that could be a lot of other things too. Alcohol being really kind of the number one that people seek out because it's so readily available. It's so kind of part of our culture. But people who are seeking out something to calm down and to de-stress is another kind of indicator that there could be trauma going on. And another one is people having kind of lapses in memory, people having points in their life that they just don't have memories, don't have a recall. That could be another symptom. So there's a lot more to it. I actually have one assessment. I kind of joke about this to my clients, but it's 156 different symptoms of trauma that, yeah, that I have them take. And it's a lot, but it's so helpful because it shows us exactly what symptoms they're dealing with, and then we can very specifically target coping tools and skills. So those are just some in general, but there's so many. One thing though, I could encourage people to do is, there is something called the life events checklist, and it's readily available. Like you can search it on Google and just say life events checklist. It's oftentimes a screener that's used to kind of identify that there may be trauma there. So it's a screener, it's not a full assessment, it's a screener, but it's a great one. And I tell people, go ahead and fill that out. And if you find yourself, with, four or more that are in the kind of happen to me category, affects me, witnessed, then it's probably, something you might want to look into.
That's so great. Okay, thank you for sharing that tool. And I know you're
Yeah.
talking a little bit about like developing healthier coping tools, and I see all of the time in my own Sinclair Method journey as well as with others that learning new coping tools can be one of the hardest parts of the Sinclair Method. Even if someone's doing well,
Yeah.
the medication is working, they don't have a desire to drink as much, they're still kind of reaching to alcohol as a coping tool. So I'm curious, do you see that in your practice? And how do you kind of help people to develop healthier coping tools outside of just alcohol?
Yeah. I mean, it's such a good point. And, I really feel like in an ideal world, like people would be doing the Sinclair method with a therapist at and doing the journey, with a therapist that can help them with those coping tools from day one. Because I feel like that's the biggest yeah, it is. It's the biggest reason why I will get clients refer to me that have tried the Sinclair method and feel like they have not been successful, is because they're getting triggered around something, or they're having high activation and they don't have the tools. And so eventually they overdrink, try to drink through naltrexone, or they just don't take the pill, and because they want the calming effects of alcohol, right? So if there's any of your listeners who feel like they may fall into that category of, why am I choosing not to be compliant? My words of kind of encouragement is really get some extra support, because once you have those tools, it does make it so much easier when you feel triggered to not reach for more alcohol. Um, and it's kind of a process, I should say, as every therapist says about everything, but it is, first we kind of look at what the coping tool somebody has, we look at what those are, then we evaluate their effectiveness, and then I have literally books and books and workbooks about of hundreds of different coping tools, but I match the coping tool with what their specific challenge or trigger is. And the thing about coping tools is, sometimes people just find some are more effective than others. And there's just kind of no rhyme or reason to that. But at least in working together with some support, you can narrow that down to, hey, this is the handful of coping tools that I think will be effective. Let's start using them. Let's reevaluate their effectiveness. That's something that I do at every session, is we start with how did it go over the last week or two, with, where did you feel triggered? What coping skill did you use, and how did that work? And then we tweak it and we reevaluate if it worked, if it didn't work, if we need to change something. So it is a process, and it's also, we're developing habits, we're rewiring the brain. All of that takes time. Like coping skills are not immediate. It's not the first time you use it, it's like, oh, it's a miracle and it takes everything away. No, they're cumulative, meaning it's repetition, and it's over time, the more you use it, the more effective it becomes.
I'm so glad you said that because what's coming to my memory was when I was learning new coping tools on the Sinclair method, because alcohol was my go-to for a decade. And I just remember having this image of like, I have this coping muscle and it's very feeble and weak. And every time I
Yeah.
practice it, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And so that was totally my experience. I remember when I first started, it was like, this isn't helping at all. Like, I was taking a bath or going for
Yes.
a walk or something. I'm like, this is dumb. Like, this is nothing like, the quick instant fix of alcohol. But the more I did it just consistently, it really took on, it really became my favorite coping tool, and alcohol was no longer my go-to. But you're so right. It
Yeah,
takes time.
that's so great. And that's a good kind of metaphor, right? Thinking of like it's a muscle and think about, right, like if somebody, goes to the gym or anything else, it's like when you first start, it feels difficult and challenging and right, the muscle is not strong. And then over time, it's amazing, how much you can strengthen that muscle. So that's a great analogy too.
Mm. So I was curious to hear just a little bit more about like when you learned about the Sinclair method. Like, how did you learn about it? When did you learn about it? And what did you
Yeah.
first think of it when you first learned about the method?
Yeah, it's such a fun story to share. So it actually was through a colleague that we knew each other through, again, traditional abstinence-based treatment. And we were just having lunch one day, and he said, have you heard about this? And I kind of knew him to be really sort of on the cutting edge. He had had his own journey with alcohol and was, in recovery and doing great. And, parlayed that into working in the kind of treatment space and treatment industry. And so I always knew he was kind of cutting edge. And he said, have you heard about this? And I had not. And this was probably 5 or 6 years after my degree. And I had been, for that 5 or 6 years, I probably worked in 10 different treatment centers at that point. So I was really intrigued and really open to it because my experience at that point is what I was doing was not working. Like, this is why I'm so outspoken about it. Yes, people were getting better, but people were not staying better. And there was a lot of people who weren't getting better. And the average number of treatment attempts in traditional abstinence based treatment is 5. That's insane. That people have to try 5 times to get the right help and to get better. And, it's the only kind of field where we somehow tolerate that. Like, if somebody had 5 heart attacks and their treatment wasn't working, I think, we would all recognize like something is really wrong with that picture. And yet here we are in this traditional treatment that, is based on 100-year-old religious doctrine and not science, that people are not getting better. So I was very open to it. I say all that because that's the backdrop of when he shared that to me. I was open because I was so disillusioned. And there's really high burnout in working in substance use disorders. And that's one of the reasons is because you don't see people getting better, or they get better for the 30 days and then they are on the relapse cycle. So I was very open. I was at a burnout point. I didn't know if I could continue, because I didn't feel like I was very effective. So he told me about it. And then he and a psychiatrist that also worked with the Sinclair Method, and I and another therapist created a business, a center where we partner TSM medication management with counseling. And so I think there's a lot of places that do that now, right? I think we were one of the first places to do it at the time. So people would have 3 or 4 visits with the psychiatrist, and they would have 6 visits with me over a 3-month period to get them started on their TSM journey. And then, of course, they could continue after that. So I just got such a great education and exposure to TSM in that time period, first by both my friend and the psychiatrist who knew a lot about it. And I saw people get better. It was remarkable. And I said, well, that's it. Like, that's it for me. I'm sold. Because in that period of time, which was about 2 years, I think that program was open, the number of people I saw get better compared to everything I had done for 6 years prior to that there was no question in my mind. So, so that's really how I, got kind of my intro to TSM. And I learned a lot in that couple of years too about who TSM is like who's the kind of ideal person. And I also learned that there are some people, it's a small percentage, but there are some people that TSM is probably not a good recommendation. I learned all about that. I learned about the things that can shift and adjust on the medication side to help people be more successful. And I developed a curriculum, a TSM phasic curriculum to take people through from the counseling standpoint. So around the coping skills, around habits, around triggers, around all of the things that we talked about.
That's really cool. Such a unique experience to have kind of the background of working in the traditional abstinence field and then transitioning to TSM. So you've kind of seen both worlds and the comparison between the two. Would you want to speak briefly about what you learned about who like are the ideal folks for TSM versus perhaps the
Sure.
people it's not ideal for?
Yeah. And I'm sure there's some TSM, practitioners that might have a different um, thought about this. So I just want to, kind of put that out there that this is just my experience, right? But my experience is that TSM is really ideal for people who are problematic drinkers, um, who have not progressed to a severe dependence on alcohol, where there's medical complications and a real physical dependency. I think when people have been drinking for 15 plus years, heavy drinkers on a daily basis, there can be contraindications for doing TSM from a medical standpoint. And I also think that those folks, I have had some of those folks do TSM, and their outcomes are not the same as folks who are in more of that problematic drinking space where it's a problem. They're over drinking. They're drinking more than they want. When they try to stop, they're not able to really stop or control it. But they're not at that kind of complete physical dependence yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that does make sense. Yeah.
And I think those are the folks that have not had support prior to TSM. And, thank goodness for Claudia. There's so many people that have wanted to get help when it was a problem, but did not want to go the abstinence route. They didn't want to say they're an alcoholic because they don't think they're an alcoholic or feel they are. And they didn't want to go to meetings every day for the rest of their life and completely upend their life. And those are the folks that unfortunately didn't get the help they need. And fast forward, because alcohol's progressive, now they are dependent. Now they are in the alcoholic criteria, or they're in the alcohol use disorder severe criteria because they didn't have an option. And so I think that's where the Sinclair method is so powerful is, for all of those folks that want another option, whether they want to eventually stop drinking or they want to gain control over their drinking, whichever their goal is, that's where, the Sinclair method is so helpful.
Absolutely. So, okay, so I want to have you share a bit more about your practice and like how it is people
Oh,
work with
sure.
you. So, I guess just practically, like what states here in the US do you serve and what does it look like if somebody is considering, chatting with you or perhaps working with you to heal trauma?
Yeah, thanks. I think you can probably put the link there, but people can find a lot of information on my website, which is Gabrielle Loomis-Annett. And if I'm sure again, you can put the link there for folks. Um, unfortunately, and I've had this conversation with Claudia, being that I'm a licensed counselor, um, our licensing boards really frown upon coaching if you're a licensed counselor. So over the last 10 years specifically, they've really tried to kind of separate, coaching and counseling into two separate categories. And people that do both, it's not really encouraged to do both. So I can only see people as a licensed counselor, not as a TSM coach. And I am licensed in 3 states, so California, Arizona, North Carolina. So if somebody is in one of those 3 states, I can definitely work with them. I wish it were different. I wish I could work with people all around the world, but um, when you're licensed, you just have to follow the regulations of that licensing board. That's just kind of how it is.
That's too
Um,
bad. I'm disappointed to hear
yeah,
that too. I
yeah.
was wondering
One,
about that.
yeah, they've been talking about having a national licensing board for years. I don't know when it'll happen, but maybe someday, in the near future. So, but if anybody is in one of those 3 states, by all means, you can go to my website and get a lot of information. I do telehealth. That's really helpful too if you're in one of those 3 states.
Okay, and let's assume someone's watching and they're not in that one of those states and they're thinking,
Yeah.
man, I really, could use some support in this way. Like, are there things they could do just with themselves to kind of get started? I know you did mention that like self-assessment questionnaire that they could take, but what would you recommend if someone's kind of considering, getting support for this?
Yeah, I would recommend, doing the self-assessment. And then I would recommend really just doing some research to find a therapist who you can work with. And so there's a couple of places you can look. Um, and Psychology Today is one of them where, that's the biggest website, for that's a kind of a directory of therapists. And you can put in all kinds of filters and search criteria in Psychology Today. So I would encourage somebody to put in or to check the box for trauma, um, and also check the box for alcohol use. I don't believe they have an MAT box yet. I actually have asked them to. So I don't think they have one yet, but I would start there. Um, the other place that somebody could look is EMDRIA. That's the EMDR International Association. So that's EMDR trained therapists. And they too have a search feature like find a therapist. And that's how you know you're going to get somebody trained in trauma. And then I think it's just sending them an email or leaving a voicemail and just asking those questions. Do you work with medication assisted treatment? Do you work with harm reduction models for alcohol use? I'm interested in working with you, around the trauma that I'm experiencing. And I'm also doing harm reduction. Like you just kind of advocate for yourself, be knowledgeable, advocate for yourself, and ask those questions.
Okay, that's really helpful. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time to meet with me today, Gabrielle. Is there anything else you wanted to share or say that we didn't touch on about trauma or alcohol use disorder or seeking support?
I don't think so. I think, again, I'm just really, happy that there's more conversation around all of this and, just encouraging all of your listeners who are doing the Sinclair method to, I just want to encourage them. And if they're struggling in different ways to, again, really seek out some help and support. My experience is that it really does work. And sometimes we need that extra help and support to make it work.
Yeah.
So just encourage your listeners to kind of keep going with the Sinclair method.
Awesome. And yes, I will link your website below so people can find the link there. And just thank you again. I really enjoyed having this conversation.
Thanks, Katie.
Bye.